We're live on the Entrepreneur's Handbook, and today we have us Lars, who's a 3-times founder, now general partner at Unusual Ventures. They're an early stage venture capital firm, and Lars is particularly focused on fintech and vertical SaaS. For today's episode, he's chosen to talk about M&A and how important it is for founders to understand that. So let's start with that, Lars. Why did you pick M&A as your topic that you think founders and our listeners should be learning more about?
Yeah, great. Well, first off, thanks for having me. And I think just jumping right in, M&A is a topic that gets a lot of attention. And certainly in this market of uncertainty is going to get a lot of attention as people think about their alternatives. And these are companies that could be early on and have maybe failed to get lift off and find product market fit, to companies that are growing, but maybe need some sort of strategic partnership. And then companies maybe that are more mature and successful that are thinking about how do they provide liquidity to their investors. So I think there's a whole range of things that you're going to see more and more in this market. So I think it's certainly timely from what we're going through and thinking about where we are in the cycle, in the market cycle. But it's also a topic that gets attention, I think, in a lot of ways because of the liquidity piece of it. There's the obvious event of getting your company purchased and returning money to shareholders. But the part that I think I find really interesting, and I want to make sure we talk about today, is the impact that has on a founder, a business. What are the things that you should consider? Because often M&A can pull you away from building the best possible business that you can build. And it can really minimize your potential because you don't fully understand the M&A process, or it ends up ultimately being something that is just a huge time and distraction away from what you're trying to build. So I think it's, in some ways, we're talking about selling your business, but in an interesting way, it's actually also about how do you make sure you're building your business to be the best it possibly can be.
Yeah, and I guess on that point as well, how do people know if M&A is even a viable path for them, whether this should even be something they should even think about at all?
So I think there's a few things to consider. And I will say, anyone talking about this topic, there are observations and things that I've seen across dozens of deals, sitting as a founder, as an investor, an advisor, a board member. But each situation does have its own dynamic. And so I think it's frustrating when someone tells you that it absolutely has to be this way, because that's really not the case. But I think there's a number of things to consider when you are thinking about M&A and understanding where you are in terms of what you have to offer, what the market situation looks like, and maybe going through what are the assets you have as a business, and maybe what are some of the challenges you have. And some of the assets could be, have you found product market fit? Do you have a company that is in market, has been bought by your customers, is performing well, has good reviews and customer satisfaction? Is that something that's an asset of yours? Do you have a team that's talented, that has maybe technical skills that other companies might want, or has sales skills where that's something that is an asset of your business? Do you have a customer set, of desirable customers that maybe fit a certain category of either mid-market or enterprise or SMB? But is there something there that is something you can say, this would be valuable to a larger organization? And then you have to be candid and think about what are your challenges? Where are you on the path to profitability? Do you have a real burn rate that someone's going to have to adopt if they acquire your business? Or is that something that's a strength of yours, that you really don't burn much capital? You have to think about the competitive landscape. Are you one of the top choices in the market? Or are you 15 of 30 choices, and that's going to be harder to tell your story? So all of those are things you can kind of start to assess. But what's probably most important is you can't think of it in a vacuum just about your business. You have to think about the strategic landscape and what the potential acquirers are ultimately looking for. What are they missing? Where do they need to get a competitive advantage? Where is time a pressure for them, where they need to think about inorganic activity as opposed to developing internally? So those are things that you have to pair those together. You have to think about your own situation. Where are you? And I should have said, maybe it's implied, but where are you in your own cash position? So again, back to where we are today in the market and people thinking about extensions and loans and how are they going to extend runway. It is very important to think about how much time do you have as a business, and both because that's going to allow you to see if you can successfully run the right type of process, but also where can you get your business to before you really think it's time to talk to potential acquirers. So those are some of the things that I think are important to think about, and do it with a very, as much as possible, an objective lens about where you are.
I think one of the tough things that maybe people don't know until they get into this world is about how many deals obviously fall through. And that can be such a huge issue where you get really excited by somebody's come to maybe try to acquire you. You have all the excitement come in, they say all the right things, but as you know, obviously most of those times it doesn't actually happen. How can founders, when they talk to these people that are coming in to potentially acquire their company, avoid wasting time on that? How can they be able to tell this is a serious suitor who is likely to at least be worth investing time in and working out if the fit is there?
It's a great question. And it is impossible, having gone through it myself at various stages, it's impossible for founders not to get somewhat excited when a company reaches out or someone from corp dev engages and says, we're interested in your business. But that's really just the very surface of where you need to start from that point on, where you need to start digging into to see how legitimate that interest is. So one of the things that I think is important to think about is, before you even have any of these discussions, is what is your personal goal? Like what are you really trying to achieve? Are you really ready to sell the business? We talked a little bit about this sort of balancing act. How do you balance all the different interests from the stakeholders in your company, from your employees to your shareholders to your customers, even, who might not want to see a disruption or might benefit from an acquisition? So I think too often in the course of being busy, you just jump into these conversations and say, well, someone reached out to me, I just got to start talking. When in reality, I wish I had, and I think it's good practice to take a step back and start to think about, what do I really want to do here? Is there a scenario where this deal makes sense for my company? Not just for me as a founder, or founding team, but for everybody as a whole. Do I see a path for that? And if the answer is no, then while it may be hard to do, you shouldn't have the conversation. You just should stop. Because I think the trap is you get pulled in thinking something's real. And this will go back to your initial question, but really, and maybe we'll spend a little more time in this, really the time you waste on these deals is so destructive to your ability to grow your business. And I've seen a lot of cases where, and I've lived through it, where you just ultimately get pulled into something, it, as you said, often doesn't happen. It wasn't truly real. And you wasted a quarter or two, not only of your energy, but of your team's time. And again, I can talk about some of the downstream effects that happen there. But so I think those are things to really consider before jumping in. The other part that I think is interesting is really understanding what the structure looks like for the company where someone's reaching out from. So a corp dev isn't the same at every company. Some corp devs are more empowered than others. Some have more senior leaders than others. So if someone from corp dev reaches out, you got to do your work. You got to do your research. And I think we talk about at Unusual, we talk a lot about doing customer validation. So one of our big missions is to help early stage companies find their path and accelerate their path to product market fit. And we're very hands-on in how we do that. And one of the areas we talk quite a bit about early on in your journey is customer validation. And I think there's a similar thing that should go on with M&A, which is real buyer validation. You have to not just, as I said, be responsive or reactive and take that call and just start talking. And you've got to not only do that prep work I talked about, but then dig in to the organization and understand how it works. What is the level of the person reaching out? How does that, or what is it structured like? Who does it report into? What's their history of M&A? Do they tend to do large deals, small deals? Can you ever talk to someone who's been bought by them? Those are the things that start to give you a glimpse of how much time this can take if you actually do it well. And I think that's something you've got to consider. And I guess I'll pause in a moment here, but I think the other thing is corp dev individuals are not only there to just execute on deals. They're supposed to get smart on a market. They're supposed to do research. They often collaborate with the product teams, who are the ones who are ultimately leading these decisions, come up with a strategy, and then they need to go do market research on that strategy. And many of the calls and outreach that they conduct are for that purpose. They're not that actually interested in buying you as a company. They just want to get a data point and understand more. And so that's something you have to be cognizant of, that you may be a part of that. You may, or even more, and I've been a part of this, they could be part of a sort of a market reconnaissance mission of just trying to understand what are the competitive options out there, what can we learn, not so much what can we steal, but more competitive than anything else. So that's something you have to be careful of as well. So I'd say, just take a step back and understand your goals, your company's goals, and then what is that organization, that individual, what do they look like who's actually doing the reach out?
So you mentioned a few different interesting things there, and I want to pick back up on the downstream effects you said, right? So if your company is focusing on a deal that's not really likely, and even if it is potentially likely but it's not a good fit, then there's time wasted, that's taking time away from the teams as a distraction. What effect can this have on different companies? Because even for my own, one of my other businesses, we were in all these different partnership conversations. And so many of them, they were trying to lead us down a path of just getting things for free as much as they could. And we wasted a lot of time on that. I think that pushed us back a few months. And there's stress involved in that. There's all these different feelings that come across from that. But at the same time, we need to be smart about that and not waste our time there. So you mentioned there was more of a downstream effect on the team. Could you explain a bit more about that?
I think it's some of those things you just mentioned. I think if you decide to move forward, and often it's not as intentional as it should be, you just find yourself in this process or going deep with a company. And as a founder, if you're in that, it's very hard to say you're not going to get your hopes up, or you're not going to start looking forward too far and saying, well, what will it be like when we got this money, or we were combined with this company, or you start planning ahead inevitably in your mind. And you start investing a lot of time as well. So that's probably I'll keep coming back to this time investment piece being a theme, not only just what you have to do it well, but also the cautionary tale that you can waste so much time in cycles. But if you start having that impact where you're thinking ahead, you are spending a lot of time, you bring your team in, which is also something that has to happen as you get deeper into the process. So then this kind of controlled thing that was just a conversation between you and someone in corp dev is now, well, I had to bring in, my sales leader, and I had to bring in my head of my CTO, and then they had to bring in someone from the product side to run the demo. And it's a bit of a, expanding circle of people who are involved in the process. And then when something doesn't happen, it really creates this negative energy and effect on the team to start saying, well, that's too bad. I was sort of dreaming about being a part of this company, or that's too bad. What did they not like about us? What did we do wrong? Like what's negative about us? When it may be nothing negative, it might just been the fit didn't work. So I think every conversation, and particularly if you start to engage in a process, it does have an impact on your business, your team, and you as a leader. And that's the piece I think you really need to think about. And in some ways, it's hard to know it until you've gone through it. But that's where I'd say deciding you're going to jump into it is probably the most important thing. And I think too often founders, because it's, I got a call from X corp dev VP, let themselves get pulled into something before they've really had that more intentional buyer validation phase.
Hey everyone, I hope you're enjoying the episode so far. If you want to find some of the best lessons from season 1 of this podcast, then you can download our free ebook using the link in the show notes. You'll also get updates multiple times a week from our editors here at Entrepreneur's Handbook, all aimed at helping you become a better entrepreneur and helping you to grow and scale your business. Let's get back to the show. You mentioned there as well about bringing in the team, right? And you gave a few examples, but how does somebody know who the right people to get involved are? Because obviously you get too many people involved and it doesn't go through. It's obviously more embarrassing, but also distracted more people. How does a founder go through that kind of logic of who should I bring into this?
Yeah. So I think this is sort of a combination of things. So it comes back to the viability of, you asked about how do you understand or assess where you are as a business. And I think that's where that overview of really where do we sit on this spectrum of being able to sell our business, because you can't just decide to snap your fingers and sell your business. It just doesn't work that way. And very few businesses actually do ever get bought or go through an M&A process at a meaningful value. So it's really something that you have to think about. All right, how credible are we as a company? How attractive are we? And sometimes you work with advisors to help you on that. Sometimes you have a board that can help you. Sometimes it's peers. And sometimes you also just know it. Sometimes you're in a position of strength. You know that your business is doing great. You're tripling revenue. You're stealing customers from the market. You've got a great technology, great team. You may actually have the ball control, if you will, to be able to go drive a process. But while that's enviable, and in some cases you could say those companies get bought and not sold, often people are more in that selling motion, particularly in a market like today where people are thinking, okay, well, maybe I'm not going to become a large outcome on my own, but I really do have a lot of value as a business and I want to go find that strategic home. So it does come back to thinking a bit about where you are as a business, and just again how much power do you have, if you will, or ability to drive the process. So that's one. The other is I mentioned doing your research, so understanding, and this can be somewhat simple from just kind of doing your own searching around and maybe a few conversations, but what is this organization like to deal with from a M&A perspective? Because they're quite different. Some companies acquire many businesses. Some only do a couple acquisitions a year or a couple acquisitions ever. So understanding a bit about that. And then I think pushing somebody. So typically, as I mentioned, product is really the key element in all of these decisions. And so if there is not someone from product that pretty quickly becomes involved in your discussions, that is a flag. If it's a, most organizations, a director or VP level person of corp dev who's only having those discussions, doesn't bring in product or reference a product leader, or even be able to reference a clear product strategy as to why they're having the conversations, that's something that would concern me. So that's something to watch out for. And then the big thing that I recommend, and I think this goes back to my prevailing theme around time wasted, is you need to put corp dev individuals and companies on a schedule. And you need to say, okay, I will explore this conversation with you, but I want to make sure we're both serious and we don't want to waste time. So let's map out what this set of conversations is going to look like. And generally speaking, not always, because deals can go sideways and eventually get done, but generally speaking, a good process, for the most part, both sides stick to that time frame. And you don't have gamesmanship where someone from corp dev just doesn't talk to you for 3 weeks and you're sitting there wondering what happened. You have people that are respectful of that, understand it, and will stick to it to show their seriousness. And certainly going back to assessing where you are, if you have competitive interest or you are able to dictate that a little bit more, then obviously that's a little bit of a different conversation. But I do think that timeline of events is a good test, because so often I'll have founders call me and say, well, they said they were going to get back to me by Friday at the latest, and that was 2.5 weeks ago, and I just don't know what to do. And the answer there is that they weren't serious about the process. They're not respecting the process that you agreed on. So something I think is also an important part of thinking about your time spent.
Yeah, I agree on the last point as well, because you just see it happen so often, right? Where you get the enthusiasm on the call and then we're going to follow up and they don't follow up. And the challenge then becomes, if you're chasing somebody, like you said, how serious are they? Because it should be something which they're doing because it's beneficial to their business, rather than because you're chasing them if they came to you, especially if they came to you in the first place.
Yeah, and I'd say this too. I think it's a mistake to say you can't market yourself and sell your business, but you can't really convince a company that they should pursue a strategy that they haven't been thinking about, they haven't prioritized, they haven't recognized as a weakness, or most importantly, in the cases I've been involved in, most of the successful deals are the ones that have some time pressure with the buyer, that they need a product by X date, or they feel like they're losing to competition because they don't have a feature or a component or an element of their solution that they can't take the time to build. So there's usually that time pressure on their side, which then also speaks to why they should be able to stick to a outline of a deal. But generally, if it's just, hey, we're just kind of learning, we're interested, that's fine. If you again being intentional what you're trying to do. If you're saying, look, I want to sell my business in 2 years, I'm going to keep focused and growing. I will have this conversation, but I have no intent to sell the business today, but I'd like to get to know you. That's great. You've just decided, you've determined what the goal of the conversation is. You have control, and you've said, that's what I'm going to do. And that's a great position to be in. Often it can be far messier than that, where you're trying to make something happen in a more condensed time frame. So I don't think you always have that luxury, but if you do, that's great. That's an optimal way to do it, is to build that relationship over time.
It's one of the things we're seeing recently as well, for example, with AI, where people are buying acqui-hiring essentially, right? So buy some of these small AI companies for quite significant multiples in order to get that team, because especially for large enterprises where they feel they need the AI expertise as soon as they can. And that, like you said, it's the pressure on the buyer side where they need to put the price up there that's going to make the deal happen as quickly as possible. And when people are considering the costing of the deal and how much to put themselves up for, or whether a deal is correct for them or not, What books should they go through there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's a real combination of art and science that goes into that. So there's no, you can't just have a number.
What's often overlooked, I guess, right? So on that point, like I said, there's so many factors. What do you think many people forget about when they're looking at that cost?
Well, I think one is just how much does the business need you? That's one. And then two is it's really critical to think about what can your business do as part of the larger entity. So I think it's a mistake to be forced into thinking, well, you're doing this now. This is the revenue you have today. This we're going to value in this. It's really more, okay, that's fine, but we're not talking about us as an independent company. We're talking about us as part of you as a larger organization or as a combined organization. We need to focus on what can that do? What is the potential? What's the upside that I can bring to you as an organization, whether it's having access to more salespeople, greater distribution, more, complementary parts to the product that make it more competitive in the market, more engineers to work on things to advance our solution. All those things can accelerate your growth dramatically. So I think you have to tell that story about how valuable you're going to be within that organization and what can that do and what is that potential. Because if they don't have a real understanding of that or a conviction around that, they're never going to actually purchase you. And then in terms of, there's all sorts of ways to handle this. If you have an advisor working with you, which in some cases is critical, in other cases maybe not as appropriate, they can help you think about ways to frame the discussion. And you can do comparables analysis and come up with multiples and talk about ranges to set expectations. There's things you can do there. I mean, generally, you're trying to make sure that you're not throwing out valuations that maybe undervalue your business. You want to listen and understand how are they going to look at your company and then try to come up with some understanding. It is something it's helpful. And I was going to say, it's not bad to cross that a little bit sooner in the conversation, just because you don't want to waste time. If they're thinking, oh, this is a company that we can buy for a very low amount and you have no interest in doing that, then if that's truly their stance, then you really don't want to go any further. So that also goes back to the buyer validation of how serious are they? How many resources do they have? Do they have, so often you see companies hoping they're going to get bought by a smaller public company, and they just don't have the resources to do that. So you have to be back to the validation piece. Can this business actually pay the amounts that we're looking for that would make all my constituents happy, would make my investors happy, would make my team happy? That's really an important consideration.
Yeah, and beyond just the price as well, there's all these other factors that people need to look into as well. What are some of those that you think people should be remembering?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was always job security for my team. What is that going to look like? And you never can get perfect guarantees of how things will work in a post-merger world, but you can understand how they're thinking about your business and your team. And sometimes you're getting deals get done and they really don't want much of the team, or they only want the engineering team, and they don't want the founder and CEO to stick around. So understanding what their plans are as best you can. And like I said, you can't always guarantee those. But one of the things I always wanted is to know that the team would have jobs and would have employment opportunities and would be able to keep doing and growing their career just under a new umbrella. And so that's something I think that's important to ask about. And then I think it's fair also to ask about sort of ways, if you can get to the point where they're also selling you and why your business should be a part of their larger organization. What's exciting about that? What's that going to do for your business? How's that going to make you better at servicing your customers? Those are fair questions if you're having a good equal, exchange of things. If you're feeling too much like you can't say anything, or you're just trying to not rock the boat, then that usually is also an indication that maybe it's going to be a more challenging time, at least to extract the value that you want.
And what's been for yourself during your process when you've had your companies acquired as well? What do you think was the hardest bit about that? Because like you said, sometimes maybe some of your staff are going to be let go. And how do you go through the emotions of that?
Yeah, I think the hardest thing for me was, they're different. So, I've had deals that have been faster, deals that have been slower, and deals that have taken twists and turns. And I think when they take twists and turns, it's being able to operate and focus your core business in a way that it performs while you're doing all the things that we've talked about today that truly are, if you're doing them in the right manner, in my view, are very time consuming. And so that's where I go back to this. You have to be so careful when you enter into these discussions because you really do pull away from your focus of your core business. And particularly if your business is actually doing pretty well and you have a lot of growth opportunities ahead and you have a supportive board and investors, you really don't want to mess with that unless there's something really compelling on the other side that answers those questions I talked about. So I think for me, it's typically you get pulled in so deep, your team gets pulled in deep, and then you're trying then to also keep the rest of the organization as normal as possible while advancing a bunch of aggressive growth, goals. That's challenging, and I think the longer a process goes, because that's another thing that people often underestimate is these deals, particularly if you're being bought into a much larger enterprise, they take time. They don't happen quickly. They really do take quite a bit of time. And while you can get people to stick to a schedule to a degree, like there are just things that take time, from due diligence and legal reviews, and you unfortunately can't condense those too dramatically unless there's something incredibly competitive that everyone's trying to go faster. But that's another thing really to think about is how long does it take? And certainly if you're light on cash and you really need to think carefully about how am I going to allow enough time to happen, because I've seen that too, where businesses they hit the cash out wall. And they have a few conversations going on. They're interesting, but they ran out of time.
And you mentioned there about working with advisors and with the legal side and due diligence. There's obviously all these other people involved during the process. How do you manage that relationship with them as well? Because you talked about with the people from the other side of the other business about putting timelines on there. Is there another advice you have for people, founders, when they're dealing with all the people around the deal too?
I think it's to not underestimate the importance of relationship building with every person that you deal with in a deal process. So I strongly believe that deals get done because you have cultivated your strongest advocates of a deal, not because you've found everyone who's a naysayer to your deal, because there's always going to be people who don't want to do a deal or who say no. But what you need is the people who will say, I have conviction. I'm going to pound the table for this deal to get done, and I really want to do it. If those voices are strong enough, they'll win out. And I think you get that in part by building a relationship with the sponsors on the other side. In part of it's corp dev, but more critically, it's people who run product and run divisions and are GM of groups and are all the way up to the CEO of large organizations. So building that relationship, I think, is really important. And it's also important with any advisor you have. So if you have an investment banker, having a really strong relationship, choosing that carefully. Like, don't just choose it because a board member said, "Hey, I worked with this firm in the past." You've got to connect. And I remember we had a great advisor on our session of deal that we sold to MasterCard, and I remember going with the choice that the board had recommended another choice, but I just had a better connection and feeling about the person I worked with, and they ended up being instrumental in getting our deal done. So that personal relationship. Your legal team and whoever you work with in legal counsel, also critically important, because they'll also do more for you if they have a connection to you and the deal. And then I think, a great CFO who can be a co-pilot in this is really critical. So you're not kind of feeling like you're fielding everything yourself. So I think those are some of the things, but just not underestimating, again, that to do all that, it takes time. Like it really pulls a lot of your attention away from, am I making all the customer visits I should make? Am I working with the product team on making sure that the feature roadmap is right? Things that you should be in on 100% you're going to get distracted and pulled into this process if you decide you want to jump into it.
Thanks so much for coming on, Lars. And I think you've given so much great advice for people looking at M&A. If people want to find out more about you, if they want to find out more about what Unusual Ventures is doing as well, where should they go to? Yeah,
so I highly recommend people, you can go to our site, unusual.vc, but what I really recommend people do is check out our field guide. So we spent a lot of time and resources on developing and building out our field guide. And part of what I think is great about it is it's what I would have loved to have when I was a founder. It's the resources I would have loved to have seen. So everything from starting your business to fundraising, to customer validation, to finding product market fit, to hiring, board management, it's all in there. So I really recommend people use that as a resource as they're getting going and thinking about how are they going to build the most successful company. Because as come full circle in our conversation, M&A and how you approach it really can have a big impact on the business you build. And so I think people really need to think carefully about it, and hopefully there's some good thoughts today.
Just one last thing before you head off as well. It's like, what's exciting for you at the moment? What's going on for you or for Unusual Ventures that maybe you should be paying attention to as well?
So we spend a lot of time, as you mentioned early in the show, we are early stage investors focused on the seed and Series A, and have one of the larger funds that's dedicated to that. Our third fund was over $500 million fund, and we invest across the software spectrum. And as you can imagine, given that we have a mandate that can look at a variety of different growth areas, we spend a lot of time thinking about what's going on, just like others, in terms of what is the impact that generative AI is going to have. And we see numerous deals that are interesting there, and we've done a few ourselves. Some in a company called Quadrant in the vector database side that's based over by you in Europe, or Hippo ML, which is the inference engine. We've got a company called Viscom, which does really amazing design renderings, really incredible team there. On the fintech side, we're just about to announce a deal that's going to help buy-side equity analysts more effectively process information and come up with their own thesis generation. So we're looking at a lot of how's AI just going to impact industries, and we're making investments there as well. And then also on the fintech side, relevant to Europe, we've done a few deals over there. It's a company called Paytrix, which is a cross-border payments platform based in the UK that we co-led a Series A that we're really excited about, and another company over in Stockholm that does cross-border compliance. So it's helping to be an optimization engine for all the compliance issues that a business needs to consider as they enter into different territories. So those are just some of the things that we're looking at, but it's an active time. And I think despite the market, I think it's a really exciting time to be in the early stage.
So thanks again so much for coming on, and speak to you soon.
Great. Thanks for having me.